IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
When it came to divorce, for instance, the fact that in Christian personal laws, if a woman wanted to file for divorce, she had to prove aggravated adultery. So it's not enough that he's sleeping with the neighbor, but it has to be with somebody in his family, which just seemed bizarre. Like, why would that clause be put in? Because it was just made it harder for women to leave a marriage. So I think personal laws have been very revealing about how religious laws are drafted in the name of the divine and are very twisted and very often, not always, but very often pit against women, making women's lives harder. And as a feminist, it just, rattles me as to how the struggle isn't just for livelihood, but it's also against laws.
Hello and welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast. At 145,000 words, the Indian Constitution is the longest written constitution of any sovereign state in this world. The US Constitution, by contrast, has only 4,400 words. The original text of the Indian Constitution contained 395 articles in 22 parts and 8 schedules. It came into effect, of course, on January 26, 1950, the day that India celebrates each year as our Republic Day. The number of articles has since increased to 448 due to 100 amendments. Interesting fact, the original constitution was not printed or typed, but handwritten by Prem Bihari Narayan Raizada in an italic style with beautiful calligraphy in both Hindi and English. Each page was beautified and decorated by artists from Shantiniketan. The deliberations of the Constituent Assembly and the environment in which the book itself was written are stories that need its own mythology. My guest today, Priya Mirza, is a professor of political science at the Zakir Hussain College in Delhi and is also the host of the podcast The Longest Constitution, which over the last few weeks has become a personal favorite of mine. In this show, Priya takes different aspects of the Constitution, like how obscenity is defined, to how children are recognized and protected by it, and how it views same-sex love, and how that view has evolved over time, and much, much more. Priya hopes to bring in lesser-known aspects of this wonderful book to public discourse and make us all a little bit more aware and cognizant of what our rights are. I want to speak to her about her fascination with the book, what she wants to achieve through this show, and mostly, what are some of the most interesting quirks about this long and wonderful book that in many ways is India itself. Stay with us. We'll be right back on the Filter Koffee Podcast.
$100. That's all it takes to begin your journey with Bitcoin and Ethereum. No, really. With CoinSwitch, you can start investing in over 100 cryptocurrencies with just 100 rupees. On top of that, there are zero charges for deposits and withdrawals, so you can trade, buy, sell, however and whenever you want. All of this, plus their extremely intuitive interface, makes CoinSwitch the perfect app for beginners in the crypto space. But don't take my word for it. Just download CoinSwitch for free and try it out for yourself. If you'd like more information on cryptocurrencies, tune into a show about crypto with me, Rohan Joshi, my new adventure on IVM Podcasts. CoinSwitch, kuch to badlega.
Welcome to the Filter Koffee Podcast, Priya. How are you doing and where are you talking to us from?
Hey, Karthik, I'm so happy to be here. I'm in Delhi. That's where I live. And that's where I'm talking to you from.
How's the rain in Delhi? I'm only asking because these days I'm in Chennai.
Well, the newspaper said today that it's been the heaviest rain in 65 years. And even if they hadn't said that, I did think that it was raining way too much. And I've got leaky roofs and my kitchen is leaking. So I know it's rained too much.
In other words, a perfect kind of situation to record an episode.
Totally, yes.
Excellent. Great. Before we go into the deeper discussion, I wanted to congratulate you on your podcast. I don't know how many episodes you're down right now, but I've heard such great feedback on that. People have randomly told me, have you heard that new podcast where
Really?
Priyas is talking about
Wow.
the Constitution? Yes.
That I still have disbelief because I feel it's like this little baby which has just come into the world, and we've just reached double digits. So I just did my 10th episode, and it's been a great journey. And yeah, I'm so excited to talk about it.
Excellent. Excellent. Let's do that. So we know each other. So I know some parts of your story, but for the benefit of the audience, tell us about your childhood. Where did you grow up? What were your early years like?
When I was growing up, there was this whole distaste for being a Delhi wala. And so I was born and brought up in Delhi. I studied in Mother's International School. And when I was about 13, my parents left for this. It was a real gaon back then, Khajuraho. And my education was interrupted. So I didn't go to school. And so I was in Khajuraho for 4 years. My family ran a restaurant there, and it was called New Delhi Restaurant of all things. And then we shifted to Bhopal. And after a couple of years, I moved to Delhi and I studied at JNU. So, it's like ghoom fir ke wapas Delhi aa gaye. So, but now I'm very proud to call myself a Delhi wala because I love the city. I love many things about it, not, of course, the pollution and the population. But yes, I'm a Delhi wala and happy to be that.
I share that love. People sound very suspicious when someone like me who grew up in Chennai and lived for a fair bit outside the country. When I came back, they were like, we give you exactly 2 years in Delhi, but I've totally, utterly, unconditionally fallen in love with the city.
Yes, but I also think that parts of the city are lovely and parts of the city are hideous. So, it also depends. I mean, location matters. So that's a big factor.
Yeah, that's true for most cities, I guess. But I think there is a romance in Delhi which I've seldom seen in most other cities.
Really? So I haven't lived in many cities really, but that's really interesting that you feel a certain romance. Do you think it's to do with the tombs, with the architecture, with the history? I think it's the history, isn't it?
So this is going to probably sound more romantic than I'm intending to, but I totally vibe with the line, "Ye sheher nahi mehfil hai," sort of a thing, because I can relate and I resonate with a lot of aspects of the city. One, of course, is the parks, right? I mean, there are actually more forests and less parks. I mean, to put this in perspective, where we live, and it's near Malviya Nagar, and there is a park which doesn't really have a name, but and I run there frequently, and the circumference of that park is about 4.5 kilometers. Right?
Wow.
The only thing that is 4.5 kilometers long in Chennai is the beach. So there's that, and then of course there's the food, there's the music, there's the seasons, the 4 seasons in Delhi. I think there's a lot.
There is.
Coming back to your journey, you're presently teaching in Zakir Hussain College, right? Like, how long have you been a teacher?
I keep telling myself I've been a teacher for too long, but it's been 10 years. I just completed 10 years and it's been a wonderful 10 years. When I was studying at JNU, I was in complete awe of my professors, my teachers, and I never imagined that I could do that. But you start teaching as an ad hoc, that's the system in DU. And when you enter the classroom for the first time, you realize the enormous responsibility on your shoulders. And it's something that I've just learned to relish. I really relish teaching. And the best thing is to meet young students, to meet a fresh batch every year. Where else do you get that? Every semester now, ever since you've gone into semester mode. So yes, 10 years and 10 happy years. And yeah. So many people say Zakir Hussain. So let me tell you a little bit of the college. I must inflict this on you. So it was initially, it's one of the 2 colleges of DU which predate the 1857 War of Independence. So one of them is St. Stephen's and the other one is Zakir Hussain College. And so it was a madarsa originally. So it's a really old college and that's what I love about it as well. And then it became, so from Delhi College, it became Zakir Hussain College. And then somebody had this bright idea of making it Zakir Hussain Delhi College. So now it's this mouthful, but yeah, it's the same institution, which is more than 100 years old. 150 actually, come to think of it, yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful. I did not know that about Zakir Hussain.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what do you teach?
I teach political science, although I didn't study that. I did a BA Pass course when I was studying as an undergrad, and then I studied international relations at JNU. But that's how academics functions. So IR students can apply for pol science posts, which is what I did. So it also meant me, pulling up my socks and reading more for pol science specifically, because my training was in another discipline. But yes, pol science is what I teach.
Tell us how it works. Do you decide that I'm going to teach pol science and then sort of you prep for it, or, how does that happen?
I wish it worked that way, that you could study what you want to study. I didn't want to study political science. I wanted to study history. And in JNU, you can, for the master's level, you can choose 3 papers or 3 disciplines. And history was my first choice, but I didn't clear it and I ended up studying IR. But, life has its own rhythm and meaning. So now I am, in fact, researching as a historian. I have returned to that love. And things have changed a lot in the last maybe decade or so. So there's this emphasis on interdisciplinary research. So now it's perfectly legit to have trained in IR, to be teaching political science and researching history, because they're so interrelated. I mean, these compartmentalizations are very artificial at the end of the day. So yeah, but one doesn't really set out. I think life just happens to you, and the same thing happened to me as well.
I was trying to probe to understand, where your fascination for the Constitution of India comes from, and when did it begin for you?
It began very recently, so it's a new love. And I think anybody who studied pol science in college would hate it. And that's what I did as well, because you look at acts and you look at the 1935 Act and you look at Jinnah and Nehru and, basically these events. So when I was in college, I hated it. And later on, I was studying for the UPSC. So I decided to give a shot at the UPSC. And it was just cram. You just had to cram it up and look at a few, landmark cases. But last year, quite incidentally, there's this particular course on the Constitution, and there's another paper on laws and rights. And I got an opportunity to teach that. And when I started teaching that, I thought that I had discovered this Ali Baba ka khazana, because it was completely different from what I had always thought of. I was groaning and moaning and dreading, teaching students a paper which I didn't like. But when you shift away from the macro history and you move to the micro history, you see that there's so much about that the Constitution, it's not just a text, but people have related to it. People have used it. And it was that spirit that it is not some distant thing, but something which has lived. It's like this living, breathing text. And that's what I really wanted to share. So it was like this exciting thing. And I just wanted to share it with this discovery. And so that's what I thought about when I wanted to start off with the podcast. Yeah. So
it's interesting. When people talk about the Constitution, they very rarely use words like Ali Baba ki khazana or exciting for that matter, right? I mean, you clearly have a very uniquely distinct view, an interesting take on the Constitution. So tell us a little bit more on why this is an Ali Baba ki khazana. What is the treasure that it holds?
Well, the treasure is, so apart from it, me thinking it's an Ali Baba ka khazana, there's also been a shift in how scholars have looked at the Constitution. So for a long time, it was mostly, who talked about the Constitution, maybe symbolically in Parliament, or when one had to burn it to make a point, or people who had to cram it. So there was never any sort of awe and, like curiosity about it. But in the last couple of years, there have been great books written about it, which have actually unpacked it. So a lot of my inspiration comes from these books, say by Gautam Bhatia, by Rohit De, by I forget his name, Abhinav, that'll come a little later to me. But even the way lawyers and scholars have looked at it has changed as well, where they have gone into emotions. And I think emotion is something which everybody connects with. So it's not just about the constitution, but it's about people who are figuring out their lives, people who are saying, hey, this can't be happening to me, and moved court. And that's what I love about the constitution, that one has to enable yourself to access it. You have to really, stretch out, you have to move a little bit, lengthen yourself. And that is the spirit that I wanted to capture for the podcast. Also, it's everywhere. It's just that we don't see it. Like, for example, liquor, like, why can't I have a drink? Why is there a law on prohibition? Stuff like that. So that for me, the case laws, the stories, the experiences of people struggling or being empowered by it is what I wanted to, really channelize in the podcast.
So think of this as a layman's question. What is the difference between law and constitution?
It's a very good question, because it's something which people often struggle with, because these words themselves can be very obscure. Like, what is law? So laws are, the authority of law comes from the fact that it is shaped or mandated by the state. So there can be multiple laws, but the constitution is like a chhanni. I love the analogy that it has to pass through that for it to have a certain degree of legitimacy. So there's this one tiny article in our constitution, 372, which says that, so when the constitution was drafted, there were already many laws which are unequal, sexist, gendered, casteist, all of that. But that's what goes into making a nation, that it has to really, it's that measuring tape which you measure other laws and say that, is this good enough for us? Is this standing up to the constitutional virtues, values of equality, justice? And if it's not, let's junk it. So a lot of the conflict and the anguish comes from that, those when it doesn't measure up and when one has to fight for it to be constitutional. And at other times it serves as a vision that, our laws should in fact match the constitution's vision of equality, justice, liberty, and rights against discrimination, all of that. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question though.
It sort of does. I think where I was going with that is, when people look at the Constitution, when people talk about the Constitution, they're talking about it as a very important book, but it is also, fairly dreary. Nobody really looks at it as this is a book that I want to read over this weekend, sort of.
Certainly not.
Yeah. So I just wanted to understand a little bit more about what is the root of this fascination, that we had for it. Maybe my next question will probably, provoke you in a different way, which is when you went through it, like you said, you started going through it in detail, probably in the last 3 years or so. When you did that, what are some of the things that really surprised you about the Indian Constitution, in a good way or in a bad way?
I think what surprised me was how I had accepted that it's a dead text. And the favorite part was about the drafting of the constitution. So even in the national narrative, the constitution was drafted, it was adopted, it was this great moment, people celebrated, and it was fantastic. But when you look at the debates and through the long period of time when the constitution was drafted, and you see that real people drafted it. They fought, they argued, they didn't agree with each other. It was also a period of time when partition took place. So the constitution was drafted amidst partition, and it was a period of self-doubt. And that going through those debates and going through that period made me realize that it was under extreme duress and extreme faith that this text was drafted. And you see it in the making of the constitution, like, who is an Indian? Are Hindus naturally Indian? Are Muslims not naturally Indian? And that sort of reading shows you those little windows within the constitution, which are not very visible if you just flip through it. But when you historically contextualize it, you see the sort of arguments which went into it. For example, cow slaughter. Why is that in our constitution? Why is right to work not a fundamental right? It ought to be, but it is not. So, stuff like that, which were like small mysteries, which have been very engaging for me as well. And I've had a great batch of students who have always challenged, questioned, and probed, and so yeah, that's been the journey that I'm on at the moment, actually.
Right. In fact, what has always fascinated me about that phase in time, right? The 3 years or so in which this was drafted, is the fact that, and I was speaking to Manpreet Sodhi, who wrote a book, a wonderful book called Lahore last week, and she made a very interesting point. She had said that on the show that when partition was happening, it is very clear that one of the pieces of land which was partitioned was Pakistan. Right? It was not very clear what is this other thing that we are going to call as India, right? Because at that point, we were filled with a lot of princely states which have not yet become part of a union, right? And what we take for granted as the country of India or a region called India as a landmass or as a political entity didn't really exist up until much longer. Right? So what I love about it is that a lot of the text that must have gone, into the constitution, a lot of the discussions that must have happened around it, in the parliament and outside that, must have been basis a lot of assumptions, so to say, right, of what is, what was, and what will be. So I find that fascinating that we almost were sort of fixing a car that was in motion.
Absolutely, yeah. Yes, there is that sense of fluidity around that time, and it was pretty much like that. And so, one of the astonishing things, which I still find astonishing, is that Gandhi was not part of the drafting of the constitution, and this is the moment that everybody's been waiting for. But he's not there. He's in Noakhali, and he's not concerned with this. I mean, essentially, constitutions are power statements that we have the authority to draft the future. So it's an extraordinary period precisely because, like you just mentioned, the princely states was still a dodgy lot. And the Constituent Assembly kept expanding because as the princely states, their representatives, as they kept choosing to accede to India, they kept coming. So I remember going through some records where, so it's promulgated in 1950, but as late as 1949, like a month before it's completed, you have representatives of central provinces, Rewa, coming in, who have obviously not done anything for the constitution, but they are still there symbolically. So it is, I mean, essentially that's what the post-colonial mandate is, to consolidate, to make a statement that this is what it means to be India and these are its citizens. So I think even the chapter on citizenship. So something very interesting is that you have part 1, part 2, part 3, and our fundamental rights are in part 3. And originally it was supposed to be in part 2, but what comes in part 2? It's citizenship, because that is something which was literally drafted amidst this anxiety that who is an Indian? Is if you're a naturalized, that means if you're born on the soil, what does that mean? Do you acquire citizenship? And there was this whole anxiety about citizens of Pakistan coming to India. So yes, it is a fluid moment. And I think it also reflects how we are a nation in the making. The project never ends, does it? I mean, right down to the recent Citizenship Act about saying who's in and who's out fundamentally.
Right. One of the things that if you spend any amount of time in the United States, or if you spend any amount of time listening to news from the United States, you will find 2-3 things often repeated, right, in the popular discourse, in the discourse around news, etc. Right? One of them is they talk about different aspects of their constitution. Right? They talk about the First Amendment. This is an everyday discussion, right? And then there is a lot of pride that they take in the founding fathers' vision for America, etc. Right? It is considered a very original vision of what a modern society should be, what freedom and liberty should be, and of course, it comes with its own problems, right? And which we all know. And the United States was formed, at the peak of slavery, right? So it's a different kind of freedom that we're talking about. When you go through this from an Indian perspective, when you go through the Constitution from an Indian perspective, two things sort of stand out for me. One is, it's not really something that we speak about a lot, right? Unless it is a parliamentary debate, the news about a parliamentary debate, we don't really speak about rights and what is in the Constitution and the story behind what's in the Constitution, so on and so forth. This is one. And second is also the perception that a lot of our Constitution has just been taken from what Britain was using as a text at the point, right?
So just to draw an analogy, if you're ever watching a Hindi movie or maybe a movie in Malayalam or Tamil, somebody pipes up and says, the original version is, it's a copy. And you immediately have a lower impression. Oh, it's a copy. And I think there is, it's a partial truth that elements of our constitution were drawn from the Irish constitution. Parts of it were drawn, a little bit of, especially Article 21 was drawn from advice given by Justice Frankfurter, an American jurist. Parts of it, of course.
What was Article 21 about?
Right to life and personal liberty. And what Justice Frankfurter wanted to exclude was this phrase of due process, which meant that courts could in fact legislate upon that and change it. So there was B.N. Rao was the constitutional advisor, flew to America around this time, and there was this conversation between them about how to specifically draft it to allow social legislation where labor provisions would be drafted to for better working conditions. But let me just get back to what I was saying. So the first thing is that my question is that if something is a copy, does it necessarily make it inferior? And the second point is that let's just get our hands dirty and look at the Constituent Assembly debates. So if it was copied, it would have taken a very short period of time because it's cut, copy, paste, something which students do all the time and hand in a presentation. But this was carefully, every word was labored and thought about and obsessed about and argued and debated. So yes, parts of it have been borrowed, but it was given a certain life and context in the Constituent Assembly when it was in fact drafted. And that's exactly why it took so long. So yeah, 2 points. I mean, that's how I see it, that it's not a good enough reason to dismiss the Constitution. And also, I think we often forget that our parosis, our neighbors, didn't really manage to do that. So when it came to Sri Lanka, they invited this Cambridge jurist, Ivor Jennings, to draft their constitution. And Pakistan struggled for many years because they had they invited trouble by trying to figure out how theocratic they are. So the point is that our constitution, something quite amazing about it was that there was a huge disproportionate number of lawyers. So what is quite startling about the Constitution of India is that it was drafted by lawyers, but also drafted with this complete awareness that what we are doing is that this has to be a machine which lasts. It is not something which is going to, we're going to pull the brakes and abandon it. This has to be a machinery which can be used by very diverse people. Look at what the sort of country that we are. You have the 6th schedule for tribal areas. You have the 5th schedule for autonomous regions. So it was a well-crafted machinery. And that's where you have real respect for the amount of time and how carefully it was drafted. And so even though there are elements of it, it doesn't really take away from it. I think the question about why do we not revere it? I think we do revere it, but in that reverence, it's a very distant object. So yes, it is sacred, and yes, we remember it, and we're reminded on Republic Day that this was a very important moment in constitutional history. But I also think that as academics, and I think there is a responsibility there, that there has been no effort to break it down and make it accessible. So it does seem intimidating, isn't it? It's just that I'm a teacher, so I have been teaching this, so I'm a little more familiar with the Constitution than probably a lay person, but it is intimidating, come to think of it. It is not an inviting text. So it, I think, also depends on how inviting we make it and how we break it down and how we see these national symbols. So the national flag, for instance, There are codes of how one can wear it, whereas Americans, they wear it on their underwear, and that's their way of demonstrating their love. But it was only a very recent judgment which said that, you can actually fly the national flag, and made it accessible. So I think it is also that element there about how we relate to national symbols and maybe rever it too much to make it relatable. So I think there's a inversely proportional thing there, that the more you rever something, the more inaccessible you make it, because it's so sacred, so special, that sort of a thing.
Right. No, I mean, I was actually talking more about it not being in our discourse as much as it is, but I think reverence is a very important point, because a few years back, we were driving from Delhi to Chennai, and one of the places that we spent some time on in that trip was in Nagpur, and we spent some time in the place where Dr. Ambedkar became a Buddhist, is converted to Buddhism. And that place, of course, has a lot of Buddhist symbolism, but it also has this mammoth statue of the Indian Constitution. Mm-hmm. And I've never seen anything like that elsewhere. Right? And I think somewhere, for a country that has a temple everywhere, in every street and every corner, I wish we'd gone into that sort of a spiritualism with this book, which would have probably made things much easier for many people. Right? One question I have is, we're speaking about how we are looking at the Constitution from an inward perspective, how you and I are looking at the Constitution. But how does the world regard India's Constitution? What have some of the world leaders over time, what have they said? How does the world see the Indian Constitution?
I think, at least in South Asia, we have been a shining example of constitutionalism. So another point is that even though we may not be familiar with the text, there is this faith in constitutionalism itself. The idea that we can, in fact, negotiate using the Constitution and its ideals. So within South Asia, and I think that there was a study done about the lifespan of Constitution, starting from the 17th to 18th century. And the data is shocking. So the average lifespan of a constitution, if you look at all of them together, is, I think it's 11 years. And going by that standard, our constitution has done exceedingly well because it has withstood the tests of time. Not to say there haven't been troubling trends which are increasingly institutionalized in the last couple of years, which especially the manner in which the Supreme Court has been adjudicating. But the longer view is that it's a machinery which has survived. The blueprint is in place. Of course, there are parts might be falling apart and institutions might be failing us, but there is nonetheless, precisely because we still believe that the Constitution can in fact survive even this sort of an impasse or this sort of a period where it seems to have where institutions, not the Constitution, but institutions have seemed to have let down the constitutional vision.
What are some of the quirks of this Indian Constitution?
So one of the things I found really shocking and startling was how sexist laws have been. So, for instance, in 1850, the British drafted a law called the Gains of Learning Act, which is, I'm just going to share a little bit about it. And this act fundamentally said that the gains, basically the money which a man made out of his personal earnings, would not in fact go into the family's estate. And fundamentally what this law did was that it allowed men to consolidate their own property without having to share it. And it just tells you as to how colonial laws and post-colonial laws have sort of aided this growing economic inequality, which I think is the most glaring aspect of everyday life between men and women. So again, when it came to divorce, for instance, the fact that in Christian personal laws, if a woman wanted to file for divorce, she had to prove aggravated adultery. And, I went over that a couple of times and said, what does that mean? Which meant that it wasn't just adultery, but it had to be incestuous adultery. So it's not enough that he's sleeping with the neighbor, but it has to be with somebody in his family, which just seemed bizarre. Like, why would that clause be put in? Because it was just made it harder for women to leave a marriage. So I think personal laws have been very revealing about how religious laws are drafted in the name of the divine and are very twisted and very often, not always, but very often pit against women, making women's lives harder. And as a feminist, it just, rattles me as to how the struggle isn't just for livelihood, but it's also against laws. For example, this whole thing about Sita, immoral trafficking act, where this whole idea that a sex worker is somehow diseased and, she can't be with good society. And for example, I didn't know this, that there are special police officers who can basically break into your house and haul you up and penalize you. And there is a fine under the act, the Prevention of Immoral Trafficking Act, that sex workers have to pay. I mean, this whole moral vision of the state, baffling. So another anecdote, if I could add, is that I was just preparing for the next season that apparently in Rishikesh, you cannot sell eggs. You cannot.
What?
Yes, you cannot. This is like brand new information, fresh off the blog, which I was reading up for my next episode. Because a couple of people petitioned and they said that there are pilgrims, these are holy sites, and I love this phrase: the atmosphere has to be vegetarian. And so the local body drafted a bylaw which said that the egg, it should not be visible to the public gaze, the anda. And I was just thinking, doesn't make sense. But the court upholds this and says that, yes, because it offends the moral sensibility of a particular community. So no eggs in Rishikesh. So yeah, there's startling information every second day.
I got to tell you, atmosphere of vegetarianism sounds like there's going to be a stratosphere filled with dokla at some point. Yeah. That is hilarious. But can we, what is your relationship with this book? Because on one end, you're very romantic about it. You obviously think it is, and you mentioned this in your show multiple times. It really is a testament of how we look at freedom, but then yet it has all these absurdities which probably were not observed back in the day. So what's your relationship? What's your relationship status with the Constitution?
It's complicated. But let me correct that I am not a romantic when it comes to the Constitution. Part of the podcast is also to get people enthused about it, but there are also many sordid letdowns, major letdowns by the state, major letdowns by the judiciary, and those darker elements I'm reserving for later because I don't want to get into them right away. But it is a very twisted relationship because the Constitution does not mean the same thing for everybody. Even the element of moving court means that you must have the awareness, the vigilance to even access law. So in that sense, accessing the law, accessing courts assumes a certain privilege. And as a country, we do not have that. The majority of our population is not equipped to access law and make it work for us. That is the darker, gloomier reality of the Constitution, that it blips. There are lights which it shines on. Yes, there have been great moments, but for a vast majority of people, it's absolutely darkness. And that is something that I will probably bring into the show as we progress. But I certainly don't see it as this magical beacon of light, which is this wand, which is fixing things, because we have a long way to go on that. What I found really interesting was as to how we've clung on to these British ideas of morality and how certain sections of the IPC have taken so long to be challenged. So, for example, this whole idea of obscenity, this thing that what is obscenity and who defines what obscenity? And the whole point is that it's so hard to define, because what I find obscene could be something which you don't find obscene at all. And the British, of course, they found a way to define it where they said that, if it incites you, if it makes you, arouses you, and, it makes you feel lascivious or prurient. And these are, again, very archaic words where you just feel turned on. And that itself is sort of dangerous material. So this idea that if you are turned on or sexually charged, you're a menace to or a threat to society are things which have shaped censorship, the freedom to expression. I think it's not the point that what the drafters of the constitution were afraid of, it is what the state is wary of. So anything which incites people is something to be worried about, and sexiness is one of them. So too much, so maybe when you walk to work, you don't want to have a billboard of a porn star in front of you, right? Because people are going to get distracted with the porn star's billboard right there. But using that idea, the state has tried to control what is horny enough to be in the public domain and whatnot. So, for example, this whole case of the Boris Becker, the cover where he was on the front page of
an international sports magazine,
right, with his girlfriend who was naked, was thought to incite people, not in a way where they would turn violent, but they would just be horny and feeling sexy. And that was a good enough reason to strike down somebody's fundamental right to expression. So maybe the way I express myself might be overtly lascivious or prurient, which is just being, it might turn other people on, but that's good enough reason to stall me.
Right. This is for the uninitiated, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Boris Becker and his girlfriend posed for a photograph in an international sports magazine, which his girlfriend being black at that time was actually considered to be a point he was making against racism.
That's
and
right.
Then
that
was reprinted, I think, in an Indian newspaper. I think probably the Anand Bazar Patrika.
Yeah.
And then some lawyer in India actually put up a case against the reprinted Anand Bazar Patrika thing, saying that is not appropriate content for an Indian audience. Something like this.
Yes, that's quite right. Yes, this was some. So the objection was lodged that the publishers were charged with obscenity under Section 292 of the IPC. And this included Saif Ali Khan's father, Patodi Ali Khan, who was a fine cricketer, but he was roped into this controversy for...
Is that because he was in the board of editors of the Indian magazine?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what I found really interesting is to see how people have been either pushed or in a way found themselves holding on to the constitution as their savior. So Usha Uthup, this is one of my favorite stories where she's this fantastic singer. She's singing for the heads of state. She's hugely popular, she's singing disco songs, but somebody thinks that this is not cultural, this is not Indian, and somehow the disco songs are not Indian and they do not reflect our great whatever civilization ethos. So again, this is a minister in the West Bengal government who says that these songs are objectionable. And what I loved about this case was that the judge listens to each one of her songs in all the languages that she sung, and he says, this is great music. I don't know what your problem with this.
In the court. He listens to it in the court.
No, he doesn't listen to it. No, I don't think he did that.
Okay.
Let me cross-check. That's a good question. But he does listen to it, and he says that I'll enjoy her music, and there is no good reason to ask a singer to stop singing because you have some idea what good music is. So these competing ideas of what is porn, what is sexy, what is not sexy, what is obscene, or what is free speech, where do we draw that line? You know, those lines keep shifting, and that's something which I find very interesting, and also important to let other people know what those lines are.
And in all of these cases, the constitution is relevant because they've taken instances from their lines from the constitution and then used it to sort of voice their dissent, something like that.
Yes, because the constitution affirms that this is what is guaranteed to you. But like anything which you buy where there's a guarantee, it's in the future tense. And unless you invoke that, it really doesn't hold water. So the constitution is invoked for the fundamental rights that it guarantees us, equality or the right against discrimination or the fundamental right to expression. And saying that this is my right to express myself. So whether it's a tweet, whether it's a Facebook post, I do have that right. And of course, these are interesting times because then the question comes of hate speech. When do I incite? At what point can the state say that I'm sorry, this is insightful, hateful speech, which is leading to a threat to public order and morality? Is that line of negotiation?
Right. You know, as you're speaking, I just feel like the constitution is almost like a misunderstood person. Mm-hmm. Like, a person who is intended some things in a certain way, but because of the words, the choice of words has been completely misunderstood on multiple occasions, which is probably a situation that all of us can relate to, because I'm sure all of us have been in that place. Which then, brings me to this question, which I never thought I would ask anyone up until 2 minutes back, which is, a lot of the episodes on your show, which I love, tells us about how quirky this book is, how out of date this book is, how patriarchal this book is, etc. Right? So, if the Constitution were a person, right, what kind of an individual would she be?
Okay, so what I think is that the Constitution is not patriarchal. It is a text which actually has been used to strike down patriarchy in all its forms. And rather than it being an ignored text, my quest is that it is a text which is extremely relevant, extremely useful, and I imagine it as a tool. So if the Constitution was a person, it would say, use me. And it would come with a manual of how to use. Unfortunately, the manual that we desperately need is something that this podcast is hoping to fill, that the Constitution is in fact to be utilized because it helps us get a better deal in life, as simple as that. So a quirky thing, again, interesting cases which I've come across is that how difficult it has been for women to even get to work. So when we think about working, we assume that you can get into an Uber and land up in office. But even getting there has been such a horrible journey. So for example, there have been clauses in the Indian Foreign Services, the IS, jobs where people are desperately trying to clear the UPSC, and this was till 1979, that if a woman who joined the IFS or the IS was to marry, she would have to resign. So that's crazy. Like, I don't think any employment, any contract today would say that, if a woman was to marry, she would have to resign. And that is never imposed on men, or that a woman needs the consent of a husband to work. And it is the Constitution which has, in fact, sliced these constitutions out. So I think the Constitution is a sharp knife which carves away, throws away rotten, old-fashioned, patriarchal, rubbish, Victorian ideas which have stayed on. And we need to pick it up. I would say that we need to pick up that, be familiar with laws, be familiar with the Constitution, know our rights in order to use that tool. And it's that constitutional dexterity is what I hope to bring about with the podcast.
And what kind of a person will she be?
Well, she would be old but rocking. So our Constitution actually has survived its test of time, and part of it is its flexibility. So she's this old woman who can do yoga beautifully, and her bones may be creaking, but she's still good to go. And it a lot depends on the people who respond to her. So, she's that sort of a person. We need to respond to her tweets, give her a shout out and say, hello, old woman, and we are still there for you. That sort of a support is, I think that's what our Constitution needs at the moment. And she's actually doing very well. And I don't know if I mentioned this, that there was this study done about the longevity of constitutions from the time in modern times, with last 200-300 years. And the average age of constitutions are in fact 11 to 15 years. That's what the statistics say. So going by that record, she's doing spectacularly well. She may need a heart transplant, but otherwise she's good to go.
Your show is titled The Longest Constitution, and it is the longest written Constitution. So I think, there is definitely many parts of it which will evolve over the next many years. How hopeful are you about this book's evolution?
When we think about the Constitution, like even this discussion, we've really looked at it at the rights and liberty and equality and citizenship. But the Constitution is also an administrative text. It talks about taxes. It talks about everyday mechanisms for resolving disputes. So what I hope from the Constitution is to unravel it to the tiniest bit. And although a lot of us, we tend to focus fundamentally on the rights about citizenship and maybe the directive principles. And after chapter 4, we tend to sort of zone out because we're talking about the president, how MLAs, what are the qualifications to be a member of parliament. But what I hope to get out of it is to bring every little bit alive and to bring out dimensions which otherwise we tend to gloss over. And I think my fundamental objective is, I'm a teacher, so my fundamental objective is for this to get out of the classroom and for people just to know the histories of struggle, the histories of challenging law, the histories of determination, which have gone into our constitution. So although it's text, but there are so many stories which are still waiting to be heard about it. So I think that's what I really expect and want out of this.
You probably already answered this question, but what are you hoping to happen through the podcast? And I've listened to it and I genuinely find it fascinating. Right? You learn with every episode. But what is the impact that you're seeking through this? What do you think should happen?
What should happen is, I think people should know the lines that can be crossed and what can't be crossed. I think that's my fundamental. If I think anybody sort of gets that out of the show, I'd count myself as, I'd be very thrilled, because whether it is domestic violence, whether it is prohibition, whether it is cruelty within a marriage, whether those many lines that we tend to invisibilize. What I want from the show is for us to see those lines. So whether it is caste discrimination, caste slur, sexist slur, or whether it is violation of privacy, surveillance. So what I would want is for people to be aware. Yes, I know that sounds very dry, but I think it is awareness and vigilance is what I hope, and just a little bit of chingari, because it's a 10-minute show, but I just hope that people use that just as a trailer and then, pursue it, or maybe read the articles that I have suggested, but just to hold on to that there are certain lines which are sacred and should not, in fact, be violated, and what one can do if they are.
So you just finished your season 1 of The Longest Constitution, which I think is a fabulous title for a show.
I have to say it's not mine. It's the great, awesome people at IVM who came up with this lovely title, and I love it as well.
That's an advertising plug for which we will never get paid. But I know, but of course it's true. A lot of the great things that comes across in our episodes, I'm sure there's a lot of people at IVM behind it. But what is next for the show? Like I think your season 1 has made a lot of people really interested in this.
Oh, that's so good to hear.
Yeah, it is. It's a fact. A lot of people ask me, since I retweet a lot of things about this show, they ask me if I know the host and all of that. So what lies ahead? What would you like to tell your audience in terms of what's coming up in the show?
So gentle listeners, I'm so grateful that you've been listening. But so we just started off on our journey, and I'm very excited about the next one, which is on the workplace. And what does it mean to work? Does the constitutions give us a right to work? What is it meant for men and women, people of different castes, different abilities, disabilities, to be able to work? So that's what's coming up ahead, and that's what we're working on. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Great. Priya, we usually end the episode by asking a guest what he or she is listening to, watching, or reading. I know one book that you're reading, but tell us about the others.
So apart from all the academics reading, one of the many books that I'm reading at this moment is this book by Julia Cameron called The Artist's Way, which is fundamentally about pushing yourself and drawing lines. So it's about an artist. I'm not an artist as such, but it really tells you as to reach out. It's like one of those motivational books which really get me going. So yeah.
That's wonderful. And you mentioned some at the beginning of the show, but what are some of the books that people like me can read to understand the Constitution better?
Yes, a very readable, accessible book is by Gautam Bhatia, The Transformative Constitution. Another great book is by Rohit Dey, The People's Constitution. And my podcast really draws a lot from both of them because they look at people and what they have done in specific circumstances. And these are regular people who are not lawyers, who are not privileged, and they're certainly not living in Lutyens, Delhi. but have in fact accessed the constitution and try to shape their lives around that. So two must read books about the constitution. And so very often people think that reading about the constitution means picking up the book, but I think that's not the best way. There are so many great books written about the constitution which are nicer ways, less intimidating ways to learn about it. Yeah.
Excellent. You're now a podcaster. What do you listen to other podcasts? Do you listen to other great shows?
Yes.
Do you have any recommendations?
Well, one of my favorite shows is Constitutional, which is about America's constitution. And it's this great show which really builds upon how the American constitution was drafted and how it's evolved. So that's one recommendation. And then there's this other one which you recommended, which is Revisionist History, which I really love for the tiny things that they connect. And so those are the two shows that I'm listening to. And one show which I've listened for a really, really long time is this one by Fabiha Saeed called Urdu Nama, because I have these madcap ideas that I'm going to improve my Urdu. So again, great show about shairi and things that one wants to dream about. But yeah.
Excellent. Great. I want to end with a question. How does your class feel about your show? Do you take feedback from them? Do they have to listen to it? Is that part of the assignment?
I wish. Maybe that's a great idea, actually. Today I'm cancelling class. Go listen to my podcast. I think it's the other way around. I think my podcast, me being a podcast, has made me a better teacher because there are a lot more, there's a certain richness which I have now, which so basically I was following the syllabus previously, but there's this whole new stuff which I now inflict on my students. So I think I should ask them how they're coping with me as a lecturer and a podcaster. But yes, I think it's been great. A lot of them have been very supportive, very enthusiastic. And I think for me, my students have been my inspiration, because even in a classroom, one feels that you want to break down things further. And if you feel that in a classroom, then, and that's what this podcast was all about, really like breaking things down and making it as relatable as possible. Yeah.
Awesome. Great. Priya, thank you so much. Pleasure as always. And good luck with the new season that's going to come out on the longest constitution.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, super. Great. If you like this podcast, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can listen to us on the IVM Podcast app or ivmpodcasts.com. You can also follow us on our social media. We are at IVM Podcasts on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to reach out to me, I am _Karthik. That's Karthik with an H on Twitter. And Filter_Koffee. It's coffee with a K on Instagram.
Hey everybody, it's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, singer and music composer Osho Jain tells Cyrus all about his debut album, SAR. Want to find out all there is about mixed martial arts? On Simplified, Chuck Narantoni and Shrikesh speak to Siddharth Rao, a national level kickboxer. On All Things Policies, Sapni JK and Megha Pardi join Mihir Mahajan to discuss regulatory initiatives related to the use of AI. And on Football Shipball, Siva Sapre and Karthik talk about the action-packed game week that it was. Man U, Barcelona, and India losing their games on the same day, Mo Salah's hat-trick, and a whole lot more. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Flay Coffee, Intel, Kotak Mahindra Bank, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Habits? Routines? How exactly do they help us get better? Well, to simplify it for you, tune in to the Habit Coach podcast. I am Ashton Doctor, and I'm going to be here to help you get better daily with some simple, easy to do habits that you can easily adapt to your life. So tune in to the Habit Coach podcast from Monday to Friday, because I believe that awesome lives start with awesome habits.